What if you're not burned out? What if you're not disengaged? What if you haven't lost your ambition? What if you're simply performing for an audience that is no longer yours to serve? I want you to sit with that for a second because I think there's a particular kind of personal and professional exhaustion that we misdiagnose all the time. You're still working, still producing, still getting things done. Maybe you're still getting a great paycheck. You might have the title you worked 15 or 20 years to earn. People might look at your career and think, what could you possibly be unhappy about? And yet something feels different. You're being heard, but you're not sure you're being valued. You have ideas, but you're editing them before they even leave your mouth. You see around corners, but you've stopped pointing out what's coming. You know how to solve the problem, but increasingly you find yourself thinking, why am I still running toward every fire? And maybe the most confusing part is this: you're still good at the job. That's what I want to talk about today. Because sometimes the most dangerous moment in a high performer's career isn't when they start failing. It's when they become extraordinarily good at succeeding at something they no longer want. Welcome back to Holding the Room. I'm Melissa Sierra, and today we're going inside the leadership laboratory to talk about something I've experienced personally, something I now see differently because of my work as a coach, and something my own DISC assessment helped me understand in an unexpected way. We're talking about preservation mode, how your strengths can actually help you stay too long, how to tell the difference between healthy adaptation and self abandonment, how to use DISC without turning 4 letters into a resignation letter, and how to determine whether you need a new job, a new way of operating, a new audience, or simply a new definition of success. Because those are very different decisions. And I think we're far too quick to collapse them into one. So let's talk about when character stops speaking for itself. Here's what I've been noticing. There was a point in my own career when something changed. It wasn't that I suddenly stopped caring. It wasn't that I stopped being capable. It wasn't even that people stopped listening to me. I was being heard, but I didn't always feel valued for the perspectives I was bringing. And that is entirely different. I spent years developing an ability to see around blind corners. I have an entrepreneurial spirit. I'm naturally future forward. When I see something broken, my instinct is usually, okay, how do we fix it? What's possible here? What's the opportunity nobody is talking about? I was championing that can do, enterprising spirit cross departmentally, but I began experiencing a disconnect between what I was trying to communicate and how some of those ideas were being perceived. So initially, I did what good leaders are supposed to do. I adapted, I backed up, I changed my communication. I tried different approaches. I thought more carefully about how people might receive what I was saying. And by the way, that's leadership. The ability to adjust your communication isn't self abandonment, it's emotional intelligence. But eventually, something subtle started happening. I didn't just change how I communicated, I started changing whether I communicated at all. I ran toward fewer fires. I stopped initiating solutions to some of the legacy challenges I saw. I volunteered for fewer projects. I edited how I deployed communication. And even though anticipating how people might react has always been one of my strengths, I became less ambitious about making recommendations in the first place. And that's an important distinction because from the outside, somebody might interpret that as Melissa's less engaged. She's not bringing as much energy. She's not initiating as much anymore. But from the inside, something different was happening. A leader was learning that initiative wasn't producing enough return to keep investing in it. And that made me feel like less of a leader. So let's talk about stretching versus shrinking. Here's where I want to be very careful. Every leader has to adapt. If you're saying, this is just who I am, everyone else has to deal with it, that's not authenticity. That's a lack of self awareness. Leadership requires range. Sometimes you need to slow down. Sometimes you need to soften the message. Sometimes you need more evidence. Sometimes you need to just pause and listen. Sometimes you need to communicate differently because the person across the table processes information differently than you do. And that is growth. So, how do you know when adaptation has crossed the line? For me, it was when adaptation started creating self distrust. I began questioning relationships, questioning expertise I'd amassed far beyond the four walls of one organization, over editing, and eventually operating with a level of paranoia around how things might be perceived. That's the line I want you to pay attention to. Healthy adaptation says, how can I communicate this more effectively? Misalignment eventually starts to ask, can I trust myself to communicate this at all? Healthy adaptation stretches you, but chronic misalignment shrinks you. When you're stretching, you may be uncomfortable, but you're learning. When you're shrinking, you begin doubting characteristics that have been validated across years, environments, relationships, and outcomes. You're not reading the room anymore. You're bracing for the room, and that's preservation mode. The original concept behind this episode was to identify that state through questions like, whose approval am I afraid of losing? If I hit every target this year, will I like who is left? Am I using my strengths or masking to survive? And those questions matter. But I think there's an even deeper diagnostic underneath them. Do I trust myself more or less because of the environment I'm operating in? So let's talk about the DISC result that changed my thinking. And this is where DISC is going to enter our conversation today. I don't want to turn this into a DISC certification course, but I do want to explain why I believe self awareness is one of the greatest gifts you can give yourself. Most people know DISC as four behavioral dimensions. D, dominance, how you respond to problems and challenges. Influence, how you influence people. S, for steadiness, how you respond to pace and change. C, compliance or conscientiousness, how you respond to rules, procedures, and standards. DISC doesn't tell you whether you're a good person. It doesn't tell you whether you should be a CEO. It definitely doesn't tell you to quit your job on any given day. It gives you language for how you tend to operate. And when I took my own assessment, I saw something interesting. My natural DISC was approximately D83, I84, S8, and C22. My adaptive profile was D85, I83, S6, and C22. They're almost identical. My report literally says I see little need to change my approach to problems and influencing others in my current environment. It also describes a natural style that is ambitious, strong willed, people oriented, fast moving, and comfortable with variety. And that challenged the original thesis I had for this episode because I originally thought maybe preservation mode shows up when your adapted style becomes dramatically different from your natural style. And yes, that can be absolutely useful data, but it wasn't my data. I wasn't becoming someone completely different to survive my environment. In many ways, I was still me. And that unlocked something bigger. You can be completely yourself and still be giving the best of yourself to the wrong target. Pause. I want you to write that down because alignment isn't simply, am I behaving authentically? There are at least three questions. Am I behaving like myself? Is this environment activating and valuing what I naturally bring? And are my strongest behaviors pointed towards something I still want? Those are not the same question. So let's pivot to the preservation amplifier. This led me to something I've started thinking about as the preservation amplifier. Because when we're under pressure, we don't necessarily become somebody else. Sometimes we become more of ourselves. We turn up the strength that has always worked. And that strength can actually prevent us from seeing the real decision. Think about DISC through that lens. If you're a high D like me, you drive, you achieve, you compete, you push. Your preservation amplifier might say, I'll prove I can still win. And suddenly you're pursuing another promotion, another metric, another victory without asking whether you still want the prize. High performers rarely realize they've outgrown something while they're losing. Sometimes they realize it when they're still winning. The question for D becomes, am I driving toward results that matter to me, or am I proving I can win a game I no longer want to play? If you're a high I, you connect, you influence, you inspire, you generate energy. Your preservation amplifier might say, I'll get everyone excited again. But ask, am I surrounded by people who expand my thinking? Or have I become the person generating all the energy? Am I connecting because I'm inspired, or performing because I need the room to validate me? If you're a high S, you stabilize, you support, you create continuity. Your preservation amplifier might say, I'll keep everything together. And stability can slowly become a reason not to move. Ask, is this stability actually serving me? Or has safety become a slow erosion of my potential? If you're a high C, you analyze, you perfect, you create standards, you solve through rigor. Your preservation amplifier might say, if I can just understand what's wrong, I can fix it. But ask, am I perfecting a system that is fundamentally broken? Those questions evolve the disc clarity filter from my original episode draft. The goal isn't to diagnose your career from your letter. The question is my strength solving the problem or helping me avoid the decision? What my own profile revealed to me is my own disc becoming interesting. High D, high I, very low S, and a low C. My report describes me as ambitious, pioneering, determined, competitive, decisive, venturesome, enthusiastic, persuasive, optimistic, active, restless, impatient, eager, and flexible. But it also says routine work and environments requiring constant focus without variation can create stress for me. So, preservation mode for me probably wasn't going to look like I'm terrified of change. I'm wired towards change. Mine could look more like I'll keep creating enough challenge in this environment to convince myself I'm still growing. And that's sneaky. And this is why self awareness matters the most. Sometimes we manufacture enough novelty inside of an old environment that we don't notice we've outgrown the container. My assessment also helped me put language around something I had always known intuitively. I love being a visionary. I love curiosity and I love conviction. I love the need for a fast moving, dynamic environment. I love problem solving. And my driving forces were another layer to this. They identify commanding, intentional, intellectual, and receptive among my primary drivers, including a strong desire to control my own destiny, pursue new approaches, and build something with enduring legacy. Suddenly, I wasn't simply asking, can I continue being successful here? Of course I could. The more interesting question became, does continuing to be successful here satisfy the person I'm becoming? For me, the emotional cost started showing up as cynicism. I became irritated and I started looking for validation elsewhere. There was also grief because when you've spent 20 years pursuing something you thought you cherished, questioning it can feel like you're questioning the entire investment. You think, did I lose years to this? Was I wrong? Was all of that for nothing? And I want to say something directly to anyone who's there right now with me. Something can have been deeply right for one chapter and still become wrong for the next one. Changing doesn't invalidate what came before. Your marriage to an old definition of success doesn't have to last simply because you once loved it. What happened next for me became important. I started finding validation through coaching, through speaking, through podcasting, and those environments became reflecting something back. Clients were getting results. People told me my content made them think differently. Sometimes they described it as an awakening. My ideas started becoming my own personal frameworks. My opportunity flywheel emerged partly because I began recognizing the pattern that happened in my own career. I started getting opportunities to co author, to guest on podcasts, to speak. And eventually I realized I hadn't suddenly become more valuable, but I had entered rooms capable of recognizing value. I had started editing in another one, and that is different. Pay attention to unprompted signal. This is important because I don't want somebody listening to this episode having one terrible week at work announcing, Melissa said the universe wants me to start a new company. Melissa did not say that. We need evidence. One of the most powerful forms of evidence is what I call unprompted signal. Pay attention to what people seek you out for before you've told them that's what you want to be known for. What do colleagues consistently ask your opinion about? What problems do executives bring you? What do people say you do differently? What do experts notice about you? Where are people pulling something from you that you haven't fully claimed yet? That's signal. For me, people started responding to the ability to challenge the status quo, to see what they were seeing but couldn't quite articulate, to name it, to see around corners. And here's the beautiful part. Sometimes your next identity gets recognized by the market before you're brave enough to fully claim it for yourself. Your job is to notice. My opportunity flywheel starts with declaration. My own opportunity flywheel didn't begin when somebody handed me an opportunity. It began when I became more intentional about my own personal brand. I had already spoken on stages. I was already creating content. I had experience, but I started niching down. Who am I speaking to? What do I want to make an impact on? Who do I serve? What do I believe? What am I willing to say that might not sound like everybody else? And that changed things. For years, much of my career had been built around being selected for the role, selected for the project, selected for advancement, selected for influence. Building a personal brand required me to reverse the equation. I had to select the audience I wanted to serve. That's a very different form of agency. And once I did that, one opportunity started feeding another. Thinking created content. Content created visibility. Visibility created relationships. Relationships created invitations. Invitations created credibility. Credibility created more opportunities to create impact. And that's my flywheel. But the first move was declaration. Your 20 years were not wasted. Here's another fear I want other accomplished people to hear and lean into. I've spent 20 years building this. I can't possibly start over. Neither did I, and neither do you. This is what I mean about when I talk about living in the leadership laboratory. My legacy isn't simply a list of positions I've held. It's the patterns I observed over 20 years. It's the point of view those patterns created. It's my network, my judgment, my credibility, my ability to anticipate reactions, my ability to see around corners, my understanding of how organizations actually behave, not simply how the organization says they're supposed to behave. A title didn't give me those things. A job description didn't give me those things. The work did. The observation did. The experiences did. And I own that. Here's how I think about it now. Your title is rented. Your experience is owned. I didn't leave 20 years behind. I claimed 20 years of evidence. And I began asking, how can that evidence serve an evolved identity? That is not starting over. That's starting from experience. Update your performance review. This required another shift. I had to change my definition of success. For years, my scorecard looked a lot like ambitious executive scorecards: title, salary, organizational influence, eventually arriving at the C suite. And those weren't bad goals. They worked until they didn't. My new scorecard looks different. Impact, freedom of creativity and expression, clients getting results, being after for my thinking, a legacy of work, intellectual ownership, and agency over how I choose to wake up and run my life. That's when I realized something. I was conducting my own performance review using the wrong metrics. I want you to think about that. Maybe you're not failing your definition of success. Maybe you failed to update the definition. I spent years measuring advancement. Now I increasingly measure authorship. What ideas am I creating? What outcomes am I changing? What do I own intellectually? What body of work am I building? What will remain when the title changes? That's a very different performance review. So let's talk about the guilt of outgrowing a good life. This part wasn't easy because there was guilt. I remember thinking, wasn't this what I chased for 20 years? Most people would kill to have this title, this role, this level of success. And that's where high achievers can get trapped because the life you're questioning may be someone else's dream, but someone else's dream cannot become your obligation. Prestige and alignment are not synonyms. Gratitude and permanence are not synonyms. You can't appreciate everything an organization, role, or chapter gave you without promising it every future version of yourself. And I think the deepest realization was that I wanted more ownership over my life, not simply a bigger title inside somebody else's structure. That matters because my assessment helped reveal the autonomy, the individuality, learning, and legacy were meaningful drivers for me. For years, title and organizational influence had been vehicles for those needs, but eventually they weren't enough. The destination hadn't necessarily changed overnight, the vehicle had. Fear doesn't have to disappear. Now, let's talk about the part that Instagram posts like to skip: fear, financial security, predictability, status. I became a big fish in a big pond, and entrepreneurship meant becoming a beginner again. There is variability, there is uncertainty, there still is. I don't want to pretend I achieved clarity and fear evaporated into some cloud of inspirational glitter. It certainly didn't. The fear is still there, but I stopped allowing fear to outweigh what the market was telling me. People were responding, clients were getting results, opportunities were appearing. People wanted somebody willing to disrupt the status quo, someone willing to see what they see, someone willing to name it. So courage became something different for me. Courage wasn't when I stopped being afraid. Courage was when fear stopped being the only data point in the room. And that's what I want for you too. Not recklessness, but evidence. One of the greatest surprises of this journey has been how much I've learned from becoming a beginner. I learned more becoming a beginner than I learned through some promotions because advancement teaches you how to become increasingly competent inside systems. But beginning again forces you to ask, should this system have existed at all? I had to learn not to assume I had all the answers, to ask for help instead of always being the person with the solution, to become more flexible, more responsive, to build systems of strength and efficiency instead of inheriting them. And I had to develop enough personal identity to stand behind my own unique selling proposition. When you've had a big corporate title, sometimes the title introduces you before you enter the room. When you're building something yourself, your point of view has to introduce you. Becoming a beginner taught me to embrace the idea that every day can contain another discovery. Maybe the opposite of senior isn't junior. Maybe it's curious. You don't have to quit to become a beginner. I know what some of you are thinking. Melissa, I have absolutely no desire to be an entrepreneur. Well, good. You don't have to. This episode isn't an entrepreneurship recruitment drive. You can become a beginner again inside your own organization. Start networking internally differently. Who are the people you've admired but never actually taken to lunch or coffee? What new team is doing work you don't fully understand? What legacy team has expertise you haven't tapped into? What cross functional problem has been kicked down the road for 3 years because everyone has decided that's just how it works here? Go investigate it and then look at your operating system, standing meetings, legacy reporting, processes, approval structures, and ask. The spirit of why we started this was probably right at the time, but we've evolved. If we were designing it today, would we build it the same way? That's beginner mode, not pretending you don't know anything, making your experience permeable again. Now, I want to give you something practical. Before deciding you need to leave anything, Go backward. I call this the career expansion recall. Think about periods in your career when you felt the most expansive, not necessarily when you had the biggest title, but when did you feel alive? What were you solving? Who were you around? What kinds of decisions were you making? Were you building, creating, leading, teaching, stabilizing, challenging? What outcomes were occurring? How did you feel about yourself outside of work? What characteristics of yours were being exercised regularly? Write it all down because most people approach career reinvention by asking, what job do I want next? But I want you to try asking, under what conditions does the best version of me consistently emerge? Now you have something useful. So let's talk about the 30-day room audit. Don't make a career decision from one feeling. Collect data. For 30 days, audit how you show up in important meetings. After each one, I want you to write down, did I lead? Did I contribute? Did I defer? Did I mostly observe? Did I tune out? Did I feel inspired? Maybe I was neutral. Was I irritated? Did I get that unmistakable ick feeling? Did I have an idea I chose not to share? Did I over edit? Was I genuinely curious about the problem? Or was I simply trying to survive the hour? Don't judge one meeting, look at the full month. Because here's a principle I want you to remember. Don't make a career decision from a feeling. Collect enough evidence to determine whether the feeling has become a pattern. That is your leadership laboratory. Observe, collect, interpret, and then decide. What if you know, but you can't leave? This matters. You might complete that exercise and realize, yep, I've outgrown this, and I still need the paycheck. Welcome to being an adult. Clarity doesn't require immediate action. Don't confuse clarity with urgency. If leaving isn't practical right now, I would do 3 things. First, get serious about self awareness. DISC is one tool I believe in because it gives you directional language for how you operate. But don't stop at the score. Ask what conditions activate your strengths and what conditions repeatedly drain them. And if you need help, I offer one on one coaching for these DISC assessments that just don't read the results, but give you actionable ways to implement them for what your today work looks like and who the future you looks like. Number 2, look internally. Is there another role, another department, another initiative, a strategic project, a transformation, somewhere you can flex capabilities your current work isn't exercising? And lastly, create adjacent arenas. Write for an industry publication, speak, volunteer, join an industry initiative, contribute to something meaningful. Find responsible ways to exercise parts of yourself your primary role isn't currently using. You don't always need to leave one room immediately. Sometimes you need to stop asking one room to meet every dimension of who you are becoming. Those outside arenas can also become low risk experiments. Do people respond? Does the work energize you? Do opportunities compound? That's evidence. Staying well and leaving well. Suppose you've done all that. You've collected the evidence, you've tried internal experiments, you've built self awareness, and you still know this chapter is ending. What do you owe the organization? For me, these are non negotiable: professionalism, good work, transparency, transition support, gratitude. Those are not organizational values, they're your values. If you abandon them because you're frustrated, you're allowing the environment to determine your character. And your character is yours. Quality shouldn't collapse because your commitment is changing. Trust matters, credibility matters, your reputation matters. But here's what you don't owe: endless fighting. There has to be acceptance around what you can control. And if you've consciously decided something isn't yours to fix anymore, ask yourself, why am I still fighting like my identity depends on fixing it? You can withdraw your fight without withdrawing your character. You can care without rescuing, contribute without convincing, be grateful without remaining indefinitely. Your character should remain consistent even when your commitment to who you are in this chapter changes. If I could go back and sit with the version of myself who was over editing, getting cynical, questioning relationships, questioning my expertise, wondering whether 20 years had somehow been wasted, I wouldn't tell her to quit. I also wouldn't tell her everything was going to work out. I'd ask her, why did you pick this journey in the first place? And when was the last time you felt inspired by the work you put into in the world and your role in creating it versus simply progressing along the painted path an organization gave you? That's a very different question because the painted path is seductive. Do good work, get promoted, make more money, gain influence, reach the C suite. Again, nothing wrong with it until the path itself becomes the purpose. Then one day you wake up with everything you were supposed to want and wonder why it doesn't feel like enough. That's not necessarily ingratitude. It may just be the information that you need. So here's this week's laboratory challenge for you. Not next quarter, not after your performance review, within the next 24 hours, wherever you're watching or listening to this episode. And I also want you to subscribe if you want more practical leadership tips. First, I want you to step back from your title, step back from your resume, step back from what your boss thinks, step back from LinkedIn, and ask, what word or words describe the value I bring to my professional life? Maybe it's visionary, builder, connector, problem solver, challenger, creator, strategist, stabilizer, translator. And then ask, when was the last time I actually lived those words? Don't ask when somebody complimented you for them. Don't ask when they appeared on a performance review. When did you live them? If you call yourself a visionary, but you haven't proposed something bold in 6 months, that's data. If you call yourself a problem solver, but you've stopped trying to solve anything because you've learned the political cost isn't worth it, that's data. If you call yourself a connector, but every meaningful relationship you have now is transactional, that's data. If you call yourself curious, but you haven't been a beginner in years, that's data. It doesn't mean quit, it means investigate. Now, you don't need to know your next move tonight. You don't need a resignation letter. You don't need a 5-year plan. And DISC isn't going to make the decision for you. What self awareness can do is help you recognize the difference between who you are naturally, who your environment asks you to become, what your strengths are accomplishing, and whether those accomplishments still belong to the future you're trying to build. Because you can be completely yourself and still be giving the best of yourself to the wrong target. You can still be winning and realize you no longer want the prize. You can appreciate the path that got you here without agreeing to stay on it forever. And you can carry everything you've learned forward. Remember, your title is rented. Your experience is owned. I didn't leave 20 years behind. I claimed 20 years of evidence. That's what the leadership laboratory means to me. Every meeting, every difficult relationship, every success, every mistake, every promotion, every moment you were underestimated, every room that you flourished, every room where you shrank. It's all data. And your job isn't to collect achievements forever. Your job is to pay it enough attention to understand what they're teaching you. So this week, name your value and then ask yourself, when was the last time I lived it? Because maybe you haven't lost your ambition. Maybe you haven't lost your edge. And maybe you aren't burned out. Maybe you're finally becoming aware of something you've been trying not to see. Maybe you've just been performing for the wrong audience. Stay curious. Keep building your leadership laboratory. Keep creating opportunity. And I'll see you next time on the holding room. Thanks for listening. And please share this episode if you think that there's someone who needs to hear it today.